chapter 15, we get to talk about a little bit more about probability, specifically talking about what kind of outcomes we can have in experiments. An experiment really doesn't have to be what you might automatically think of, an experiment where you try a drug trial or something like that. That's not the type of experiment we're talking about. This experiment is just some action whose outcome can vary, and we're going to record possible outcomes and determine probabilities. So for example, we could toss a coin or toss a dice, or even a couple having a baby. That's supposedly, in our context, an experiment where the outcomes could be a boy or a girl. So those are the kind of things we're talking about. A sample space is a listing of all the possible outcomes of an experiment. So we just list them all out. And what we're going to do for this section is just talk about 4 different experiments and find their sample spaces. For the first example, we're going to talk about the quintessential tossing of the coin. If I tossed one coin, for an example, I would have a sample space. We usually write capital S, and we write it as a set. I would have the outcomes heads or tails. What about if I toss 2 coins? I really encourage you, while you're watching these videos, to stop after I pose a question like this, pause the video, and consider what the outcomes are before you just listen to what they are. So what would they be? Well, our sample space in this case, we could have heads on both. We could have tails on both. We could have heads on the first, tails on the second, or tails on the first, heads on the second. So there's 4 possible outcomes. Now we're going to talk about counting outcomes in the next section. So for right now, we're really just trying to count it by hand. Alright, so for example 2, I'm going to leave it on the same screen because it's very similar. We have a basketball player who's shooting 3 free throws. Say that 3 times fast, huh? 3 free throws. And we're going to record the result as either S for success or F for failure. So you either make the basket or you don't make the basket. What's the sample space? So again, and you can call your sample spaces like S1, S2, S3, something like that if you wanted to record them all. It doesn't matter. Or you could leave that off altogether. I don't really care. So we could have all 3 baskets successful. We could have 1 failure, and that could be the last one, the second one, or the first one. We could have 2 failures. Those could be the last 2, the first and the last. Oops, that's supposed to be an F. Let's just go back and delete that. Or it could be the first 2, or we could not get any of the baskets. So we see we systematically went through this. All successes, 2 successes, 1 success, no successes. So we make sure we get all of them. So that's the sample space. And each of these guys could be thought of as being equally likely. If I have a 50-50 chance of getting success or failure, depending on the person, we could say maybe someone has a 50-50 chance, then each of these could be equally likely to occur. However, if we have a person who has a success rate of, say, 70%, then we know they're more likely to get all successes than they are to get all failures. And we're going to talk about those differences as we go forward in future sections. Example 3 kind of illustrates the fact that we really need to pay attention to the question itself. So again, we have a basketball player shooting 3 free throws. But this question specifies that we're going to observe the number of successes. We're not going to observe successes or failures of each individual trial. In this case, our sample space, I could have 0 successes, or 1, or 2, or 3. So our sample space is very, very different than what it was in example 2. So it's really important to read the question and to understand what it is you're expected to record out of your observation in the experiment. In example 4, we're going to roll a single die. So a die has 6 sides, labeled 1 through 6, and it says the observation. So in other words, the observation is what is it we're writing down each time we try the experiment. The observation is the number that comes up. So the sample space, we could get the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. Okay, those are the only ones we're going to talk about for this particular section. But in the next section, we're going to do a lot more sample spaces, and we're going to talk about how to count them. So as we get more complicated, we want to make sure we don't forget anything in the sample space. And so we'd like to know how to count ahead of time to know how many there should be. So for example, in this case, rolling one die, it was very easy to know that I had 6 things that I was going to write down because there's 6 options for rolling a die. But as we go further, it might be a little more difficult. For example, when I roll 2 dice, how many are there going to be? And that's something we're going to talk about in the next section.